Welcome to today's program titled Establishing Goals. This program is part of Seyfarth's Inclusion and Diversity webinar series. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged in to the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and is required for CLE credit. This session is being recorded. Copies of the webinar recording and materials, along with the CLE attendance form, will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. This presentation has been prepared by Seyfarth Shaw, LLP for informational purposes only. The material discussed during this webinar should not be construed as legal advice or a legal opinion on any specific facts or circumstances. The content is intended for general information purposes only, and you are urged to consult a lawyer concerning your own situation and any specific legal questions you may have. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Laura Mecklin. Laura, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon to our guests. It's fun to see a lot of familiar names on the attendee list today. So my name is Laura Mecklin. I'm a partner in our San Francisco office and a member of our People Analytics team. For those of you not familiar with that team, we have actually as a co-presenter today, Annette Timon, who is a co-chair of the People Analytics team, as well as Mike Childers, who is an associate colleague of ours dedicated to the People Analytics work that we do. Broadly and beyond the folks that you'll see on this webinar, the team is a group of professionals and attorneys focused on the intersection of analytics and law. We're lucky to have various labor economists and other analysts who are members of our team. And we do work in a variety of different areas. So today you're hearing from people who are focused on diversity and inclusion consulting as part of the People Analytics group. We also have focused on pay equity as well as litigation matters and others. So welcome Annette Timon, our co-chair, and also to Mike Childers. Pleased to be presenting with you today. So next slide, Kelly. We wanted to go over quickly our agenda. So we have three buckets of information that we wanted to talk to you about today. So first, I'm going to provide just kind of some basic framework of how we frame up the discussion around goals within our work in the D&I space. And then Annette and Mike are going to talk to us about a three-step framework that we use to guide our work in setting goals within the D&I space. And we want to talk a little bit about resulting issues. Once you set goals or benchmarks, often there are associated questions around transparency and accountability for holding the organization accountable, and how transparent are you with respect to goals and benchmarks. So let's jump right in. Kelly, next slide. So in this first topic, and then, sorry, the next slide as well, we need not explain to you all the societal, framework that we all are existing in, and the ways in which we are dealing with issues every day in the workplace. It's really, the American workplace is a reflection, constantly of evolving issues that we see playing out in the political arena, as well as, with our society at large. So we've included some logos here on issues that our team just even this week have advised on in terms of how employees are showing up to the workplace and demanding an ability to talk about certain subjects, to engage with each other, raising concern about various subjects, and then, of course, asking for their employers to focus on various of these issues, including building a culture of inclusion and focusing on diversity. So next slide. With this framework in society at large in mind, we face questions every day as employment lawyers about whether companies can, set goals or focus on certain types of diversity efforts or initiatives. So it's helpful for us to root those conversations in the fact that various key court cases, as well as the EEOC, have recognized that diversity benefits are, in fact, very real for American business, and that it's important to develop a diverse workforce, cultures, ideas, and viewpoints. We add a case quote here from, obviously a well-known case. We also see this in the next slide from the EEOC. So in the EEOC's own guidance in their compliance manual, the EEOC talks about diversity efforts being something that can be designed to open up opportunities for your workforce. They also talk about the fact that people subject to Title VII, and companies can allow various flexibility in the way in which they manage their workforce to accomplish the purposes of Title VII and in the statute. They do warn, because they are the EEOC, of course, that you have to be careful in your implementation of both affirmative action and diversity programs. And that's the parameters of what we really want to talk about today. How can we push forward work in the D&I space while also managing for risk, but essentially not being the no people? We're accused a lot of being the no people as employment lawyers. And right now, again, given different events going on in our society and what expectations are from our employees, it's incumbent upon us to provide business solutions for businesses that have to prioritize inclusion and diversity as part of their overall strategic goals right now. So let's dive into what that looks like. So on the next slide, we have what we call essentially a risk spectrum. And this is one way in which we like to think about the ways in which goals and benchmarks can be set. So if you're looking at a risk spectrum for most companies, we think about the least risky in terms of looking at data around representation being simple tracking of representation data. And what we mean by that is at any given point in time, in fact, today, you can go and likely pull from your HRIS system or some other place the current demographics of your organization, and you can do that on an ongoing basis and simply track it just to understand whether you're making progress or not. A step further than that, adding a little bit of legal risk and something that you'd want to manage, is then taking that data and actually doing a more comprehensive review or analyzing representation data in certain ways. That means manipulating the data, figuring out trends, trying to look at it in a way that would be more than a simple snapshot of that data. Moving down the risk spectrum, we would look at setting benchmarks or goals as the next step in adding some legal risk to the way in which you might use data to track your representation and to focus on a business strategy through the use of data. And that's what we're going to obviously focus on in our much broader and more focused conversation today. How do you do that without crossing that red dotted line that we see there, which we think is really the line into the most legal risk and, in fact, prohibited by Title VII and other EEO statutes, which is essentially setting quotas or essentially determining set-asides for, certain practices that you might have as a company. It's unlawful to have a quota system where you hire a certain number of people based on their EEO status. So how do we stay on the right side of that red line and make sure that we're setting what we call benchmarks or goals? Now, we have a final box down here called voluntary affirmative action programs. We're not going to get heavily into this topic today, but there is a way for private employers to build what you call a voluntary affirmative action program. There are specific requirements for that. Essentially, if you build one of these, it can be an affirmative defense to a allegation of discrimination. But what it requires you to do is declare a manifest imbalance of some type with a certain representation in your company, and essentially say that there is a manifest imbalance in the statistics in that representation class for the company, and then have an actual affirmative action plan built around that manifest imbalance. Many of our clients have not opted to do that just because there are some risk factors and details that would be required to implement that. So what we're going to focus on today is really the box above that, which is for private employers setting benchmarks or goals that fall short of quotas or set-asides without then moving into setting a voluntary affirmative action program. In the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the actual concepts we're using when we're using the term benchmark or goal. There are likely people on the phone that do a lot of AAP or other type of work, within their day-to-day, scope of responsibilities. So here we just wanted to differentiate the terms that we're using. So we're using benchmark in the generic term as a generic term, basically a comparison using some reference, usually from outside of your organization, an aspirational comparator, and something that is not mandatory. We're also using the term goal in a similar way to indicate something that's a desired outcome, something that a company might use a good faith effort around in terms of trying to achieve it, something that's aspirational but also not mandatory. And that's what would differentiate it from a quota or a set-aside, a quota obviously being a required target, something that is mandatory, not optional, a specific number. For example, setting a number for hiring or promotion that is required to be met by your organization or by certain managers of business units. And then obviously a set-aside being a reserved number of jobs or promotions, something like that. Again, something being mandatory and not optional and reserved for certain underrepresented groups. So with that, I think we're going to move forward into a lot more specifics where Annette and Mike are going to talk to us a bit about the nuts and bolts of actually designing goals and benchmarks. So Annette. Annette, you're on mute.
I thought I unmuted. Sorry about that. So as we move forward, we want to set the framework in terms of how we move forward in this process. And there's lots of thoughts about how you go about establishing goals as a starting point, or we get questions about inclusion and diversity efforts and can we implement a particular program, and we tend to come back to, well, what does your analysis show? What does your data show? Let's start there as a starting point. So if we go to the next slide, as we approach this presentation, we wanted to kind of ground the analysis, and the first is conducting that self-analysis, taking a look at what is reasonable for purposes of your organization and your workforce, coming up with conclusions about what the analysis tells you. If you're comparing yourself to some benchmarking or external information, what does that tell you about the efforts and the focus that you should be engaging in on a go-forward basis? And then from there, you would be implementing programs that would support what the analysis is showing you from an overall perspective. So let's go ahead and I'll get started on the reasonable self-analysis and what that means. And as Laura mentioned, some of the things that we're talking about here are things that we see in practice, that we work with our clients about. It has a basis in what the EEOC describes as a reasonable framework for moving forward. It has some similarities to what federal contractors do, but it is not based on what federal contractors do. The purpose of this discussion and this analysis, we were very purposeful about not sort of making this about things that are specific to federal contractors. As we sort of think about this, though, the first global issue is that the effort that you are engaging in is to identify if there's areas of opportunity for underrepresented groups at the organization, right? And so especially in this particular time, we hear a lot of sort of goal setting. I've already seen some questions that are coming up about, do I have to be limited to what a goal under an affirmative action plan would require? And as we move forward, we have to be mindful of what we started with is that employers are still bound under Title VII principles, right? And so what you're trying to do is balance where you are as an organization against some benchmark, most typically the reasonable recruitment area that you are engaged in. And if you start there from that from that perspective, it will tell you where you have areas of opportunity, and then you can drill down. As you begin moving forward in this with this analysis, we do recommend as a starting point that the analysis be conducted under attorney-client privilege. You may decide at some point to share portions of your internal self-analysis, but there currently is no, self-critical analysis that an employer might undertake. And so some of these data points, you're kind of looking at them and you're trying to get underneath, what does that mean? Here's what those census data or whatever benchmarking data is out there, and you're really drilling down to get underneath it. So as a starting point, we do recommend moving forward with that analysis under the attorney-client privilege until you get to a reasonable framework for where you can move forward as an organization. And as you're thinking about it, where you want to start is what your current population looks like compared to the surrounding labor market. And you're going to be looking at, we certainly recommend, to the extent possible, drilling down to the specific jobs that you have. That would be the ideal scenario, but that's oftentimes not possible to really drill down to that level. So coming up with a job title by job title analysis, that's the preferred approach. But you can certainly do it by certain business levels, job levels, and do comparisons both against the data that's out there, but keeping in mind your geographical areas. If you're looking at a robust diversity and inclusion program, we are talking about getting underneath it. So you're starting with where do we look from a representation perspective at each, at the various levels of the organization, but you're also taking a look at how your C-suite looks. What does board representation look like for your organization? If you're taking a look at the levels that you have within your organization, how does the level of individual contributors compare to the representations of supervisors and managers? You're taking all of these pieces together to build a robust program, and there's no sort of one size fits all approach. It's really taking a combination of factors and weaving them together to really take a look at your framework or your self-analysis overall as you move into the next pieces, steps 2 and 3, which we'll talk about shortly. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who's going to delve into a little bit more about the specific benchmarks and how you go about doing the benchmark analysis.
Thanks, Annette. So as both Annette and Laura have alluded to, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. This is meant to be flexible, and it's going to be organization-specific. To that end, the purpose of benchmarks is for the organization to figure out kind of what accurate metrics look like for the organization, so that they can kind of assess progress and so that they can kind of dial in on what areas of opportunity they might have and on what appropriate responses or programs they might undertake. As part of that, specificity is really going to be the name of the game when it comes down to establishing these metrics. The more that you can zero in on the exact population or construct these benchmarks to address kind of apples and apples rather than mixing apples and oranges, that benchmark is going to be more useful, and it's going to help you kind of have a more robust and a more effective program. So what you want to avoid in setting up these benchmarks are benchmarks that are based on kind of nebulous perceptions rather than on hard data. So ideas like, well, we should have, off the top of our head, 50% representation of men and women throughout the entire organization. Well, drawing a kind of bright line across the entire organization without respect to what the data might say about available populations for those jobs or available populations for those jobs specifically within the reasonable recruitment area just doesn't give you a very accurate benchmark from which to start. So you're gonna construct these benchmarks kind of based on, like I said, hard data and realities. So these are going to be drawn from primarily 2 different places. The first is going to be from your external availability, and this is going to be that reasonable recruitment area that we keep talking about. So with the reasonable recruitment area, there are a couple of different primary data sets, and I'm just going to go into a few of them. They're far more than even the ones I'm going to mention, and we're happy to talk offline about all of the different data sets that are available and all the tools that employers can use. But just starting off, the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases multiple data sets, both monthly and quarterly, on employment statistics, on current population statistics, and on both job and industry specific data. This can be really helpful in kind of setting up those external benchmarks, and they draw them, major metropolitan area. They draw them on state. They draw them nationally. They draw them regionally. So you can kind of pick the data set that makes the most sense for you based on how your company is oriented. I know we got one question that is, what does a reasonable recruitment area look like now that we have the advent of greater telework and now that we have more of a work from home situation? Well, you have some data sets that have kind of entire US-based populations that you can look at. Depending on the position, depending on the work involved, and depending on how you go about filling open positions for those jobs, a full U.S. view might be the one that you want to look at when trying to determine the reasonable recruitment area. If you want to get kind of even more granular in terms of position than BLS does, you can look at the census data, which is driven by specific SOC codes for individual jobs. That'll actually allow you to break out things like software development engineers from computer programmers, from hardware development engineers, to try and zero in on specific skills that the population might need to have in order to perform jobs, so that you can create kind of more qualification-based benchmarks that might be really useful. Another really good one that we've seen are the EEO1 reports that are put out every year, and drilling those down using the NAICS industry code, so that you're not just talking about the overall population within a job, but you're talking about an industry-specific population within a job. So like everything, there are pluses and minuses to all of these data sets. The EEO1 allows you to get industry-specific, but it doesn't necessarily allow you to drill into a job basis, but rather a job-level basis, like officials and managers versus professionals. So in addition to that external component, you also want to look internal and say, we're going to look both at who we might bring in terms of external talent to fill openings, but also who within our current organizational structure might be able to move up and fill some of those openings. And this is what we call your reasonably promotable population. So if you're an organization that has, for example, set lines of progression, you're going to want to include the demographics on the lower side of those set lines of progression when figuring out what a reasonable benchmark for availability within a specific job might be. Similarly, even if you don't necessarily have set lines of progression formally, but historically you know that your senior financial professional position openings happen to frequently be filled by junior financial professionals within your organization. Well, you're going to want to look at the race and gender demographics of those junior financial professionals and factor that in when you're building your reasonable benchmark for those senior financial professional openings. Can we get to the next slide, please? So some of the other kind of additional considerations about benchmarks, and as I've said, this is all going to be kind of company specific, and this is all going to be meant to kind of maximize your flexibility. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you have a clearly articulable reason for why you have undertaken the analysis that you've undertaken, and why you're considering the benchmarks as the basis for that analysis that you're considering. Because the benchmarks that you end up choosing are going to be the ones that kind of define your path forward as an organization as you can put any inclusion and diversity initiative in place. And also, they're going to be what you use to measure the effectiveness of any initiatives that you might put in place. So a couple of considerations that you want to have when thinking about this. How are you going to construct these benchmarks? Are you going to be looking at kind of separate ones for individual positions? Are you going to be trying to look across levels of the organization, like senior management, supervisory, director level? Are you going to try and look at kind of departments or business units and say that we want benchmarks for finance that are going to be different than benchmarks for human resources, for example. How are you going about defining the relevant labor market? Are you looking at historically the kind of recruiting trends that you have done as part of your reasonable self-analysis? Do you have any reason to believe that those historical recruiting practices may have created areas of opportunity such that you need to adjust those as part of constructing the benchmark or as part of your reasonable response? When thinking about kind of all of these things, the idea is that you want to be able to kind of dial in and have an idea of where your areas of opportunity are and how to maximize and leverage those by implementing certain policies on a go-forward basis. And as a general rule, we think that the most helpful way of doing this is to take a look at the rates at which various things are happening, and also take a look at kind of your current population utilization. So we would say that you should do this with respect to your current employee population, but also with respect to your hiring trends, your promotion trends, your termination trends, and also your applicant pool, and see if the applicants that you're actually getting into your talent pipeline are what you would be expecting to get into your talent pipeline based on the individual data around your reasonable recruitment area. We think that at the end of the day, the metrics need to be more specific than just taking a blanket look at how many women are hired compared to men, or how many people of color are terminated compared to white employees, but rather should focus on rates within those available populations. Next slide, please. Fantastic. So after you've kind of undergone this self-evaluation, the next question is taking a look at the results of that self-evaluation and deciding, do we have a reasonable basis, or have we identified kind of solid rationales for implementing some kind of inclusion and diversity action? And if the self-analysis reveals that you have underutilization in your current employee population, or if it reveals, for example, that your applicant pools aren't as diverse as we would expect them to be based on a comparison with the reasonable recruitment area, then that's a reason that the company should implement some kind of action plan. And those reasonable bases might be as simple as, we have underutilization and we need to dig into why we have the underutilization and dig into how to correct it. Or it might be something like, well, we've looked at our applicant pool, and based on certain recruiting practices, like recruiting from specific universities that happen to not mirror the diversity of the reasonable recruitment area, or having certain preferred educational requirements that tend to screen out certain populations at disproportionately higher rates, we may need to adjust the way that we go about constructing our applicant flow and thinking about our employee population. At the end of the day, the exact program that you choose should be tailored to meet the specific findings in your analysis. So they should have some basis in trying to really address those areas of opportunities that you found. It's also important to note, what a conclusion that a reasonable basis exists does not require. And it doesn't require that you admit or make a finding that discriminations happen. It does not require that you determine that the organization or individuals have violated Title VII and that's why you have these area of opportunities. And finally, the implementation of any kind of inclusion and diversity program or inclusion and diversity initiatives does not require you to waive any defenses that may have existed and may still exist to why the areas of opportunity arose in the first place. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Annette to talk about some of the lawful program that you might want to implement to address these areas of opportunity.
Okay, great. So let's dig in. Right now we're talking about the sort of phase 3 when we're looking at our pillars. So you've got the data, you've taken your data and you've analyzed it in multiple ways. You perhaps have looked at hiring activity against your applicant flow, you've looked at promotions, you looked at your incumbency, and now you are and you've determined that second piece is that you do need to implement some efforts based on the areas of opportunity that were identified. Generally, as you're moving through this process, you want to be mindful of what the analysis is showing you and not take a blanket wholesale approach, but really engage in targeted efforts based on the data and the analysis that you've sort of dug into. So implementing those lawful programs, you want to move forward with reasonable actions. This is where employers can get into trouble in terms of how far they want to go in terms of making specific decisions. So as you think about it, you are trying to achieve the Title VII, the purposes of Title VII. And I should have framed this as we are talking about a U.S. based analysis here. So the purpose of Title VII was to improve the economic and societal conditions of minorities and women. And obviously, some of those areas have expanded. Some employers are looking at broader terms, broader definitions that may not apply necessarily to Title VII, but that's the framework under which we are looking at what is permissible for building these programs. And so you want to solve the issues that were identified and disclosed in that analysis. So if you are seeing that you don't have enough women or Black employees or female Black employees moving up through the pipelines and the promotions, you want to have a program and implement a program that's targeted and understanding why those issues are coming into place. As you think about your overall D&I strategy, it should function as a concerted program, like a well thought out program that's designed to meet the specific needs of the organization. We oftentimes get questions that will just come up because there's a particular program that everybody seems to be, moving forward with. So for example, diverse slates, we get lots and lots of questions about. We want to implement diverse slates. How do we do that across the organization? And we typically come back to what does the analysis show, that where is it that you need to implement that program? So it's not an ad hoc event that you're doing or implementing because everybody else seems to be using it. Diverse slates are very, very helpful and very effective for those positions where for whatever reason you are getting sufficient people through your pipeline, but they are not making it through the steps in your recruiting function. So that's definitely an appropriate use. It tends to work better, though, when you are targeting specific groups. So if your analysis demonstrated that for senior level positions, may want to consider to target that specific need. Engage in a program that's in place temporarily. So when you no longer need that program, when you've achieved your goals, your aspirational efforts have been realized, then you want to continue to monitor. But if you continue to have a program in place, that's when you sort of can tip the scale if you don't sort of stop using that program when it's no longer needed. The idea here is that you are trying to drive organizational change. And when you're monitoring this and really implementing cultural shifts in your organization, that, people all of a sudden you're really recruiting from the right places, you've tapped into the right sources to get people to come into your organization, then you may be able to dial back some of the specific programs that you had in place so that you're not sort of sort of tipping the scale in a different direction and ending up with sort of reverse types of claims. I talked about the action being specific to the goals and the objectives that you have in mind. We do recommend establishing, functional level goals. So you might have an overall goal for an entire organization, but you might have pockets of an organization that if you just looked overall, some of the analysis may not reveal that a particular group, a particular business unit needs more targeted work in a particular area. So taking a look at your business units, at your functions, to see what specific efforts you can implement for driving those would also be helpful. And then if we can go to the next slide. Here we're talking about the reasonable action. I'm just going to give you some, really high-level examples as we think about this. So the aspirational goals, right, are based on that comparison. So that is something that employers can and should be doing to do that initial assessment. You can engage in targeted recruitment, right? So there were times when the EEOC even has examples of engaging in recruitment efforts because you realized that your sources were not robust enough. So you can engage in targeted recruitment efforts so long as that you're not doing it exclusively. So, for example, let's just you can expand your efforts. Perhaps you're recruiting from historical Black colleges and universities. So you want to be able to make sure that you're improving and increasing the pipelines. You're certainly going to want to eliminate and revise any selection procedures that are having an impact, and you only can do that by thoroughly understanding what might be driving the differences. Some employers have decided because they don't have a skilled, they need a skilled workforce, they will go ahead and establish apprenticeship programs to address those issues. Some of the areas that courts have found run afoul of, a permissible contact is, terminating white or male employees to replace them with others. We've actually seen or heard of questions like that coming up even fairly recently. Creating or setting aside positions specifically, which are only available to individuals of color or to women. That is also something that's not permissible in the general framework that we've been discussing today. Having training programs or having certain programs that are only available to diverse employees or women is also not permissible. And refusing, obviously, to hire or deciding to terminate employees to specifically deal with the goals that you have is also not permissible. As we take a step back and we think about goals, and as Laura's going to talk about communications to the workforce about your goals and your strategies, one of the things to always keep in mind is that what we're trying to be divorced from is setting a goal, a numerical number, and then having managers specifically targeting that number. So, for example, I have an overall representation goal of 25%, and for women, let's just say for women, and the managers, through the discussion, what does that mean for me? Does that mean 10 women? Does that mean 15 women? How many women do I need to bring in the workforce? And then making specific decisions on those, to hire 10 women or to promote 10 women to hit that number. That's where you're crossing the line and you are making race and gender-based decisions. But all the programmatic relief, if we can go to the next slide, that you can do in order to increase the opportunity to ensure that you are going to increase representation, not because you're making race and gender-based selection decisions, whether that's promotion or hiring, but that you're engaging in programs that will increase the likelihood that through this process and through the programmatic efforts that you're doing, you're going to increase your diversity and reach your goals, your aspirational goals. We put this slide up. This is the sort of larger risk spectrums that we've talked about for reasonable action. The one that Laura started out with really focused on the data and the metrics and goal setting metrics. If this is this diversity inclusion is part of this webinar is part of a second series, and in our first series, we spent more time talking about the different components that we often see, or the types of programmatic relief. And again, this is part of a series, so we'll probably delve into some of those issues a little bit more. But these are just a few sort of levels, and the higher you get in the spectrum, or further along in the spectrum that you get, the higher the risk increases. So certainly all the kinds of efforts that employers engage in around creating inclusive company culture, whether it involves implementing affinity groups or having diversity inclusion councils or conversations about, what our workforce wants to be and the behaviors we want to achieve. That's all part of creating a inclusive company culture. And then along that spectrum, we are bringing potential program and making sure that you have really thoughtful approaches to bringing your top talent that happen to be diverse into that particular group. This targeted recruiting and outreach, making sure you're engaging those efforts. Diverse slates we touched on. Programs and how they can go about implementing these issues, but it all sort of falls in a spectrum in terms of overall risk. The closer you get to making a specific employment decision, pay, promotion, hiring, for example, based on race or gender, that's going to be on the very, very high end of risk, but creating programs, opening up any potential barriers that were, didn't realize were even there. Removing, let's go to the next slide and we can talk about some of that. Removing some of the, for example, educational requirements. You might have jobs that are very specific and you really do need experience requirements. There's certain minimum experience requirements that are needed, or certain educational requirements. That's often one that comes up. Must have a bachelor's degree. Well, the question is, do you really have to have a bachelor's degree? If that is impeding certain groups from moving through the organization and you actually don't need that for a particular job, then consider whether you want to roll those back. That's not to say that you cannot have them. It's just to say that looking at it from a D&I lens, do all of your jobs, do all of your professional jobs, or do all of your management jobs need to have that kind of educational requirement as you go through the process? One of the other issues to think about is there are other ways to manage goals and your benchmarks, right? So as we have been talking about data and goal setting, we've been talking very specifically about numbers and data and your employee counts and benchmarks, right? But there's a lot of additional information that you can build into your analysis as you think about the overall strategy for moving forward on inclusion and diversity efforts. So overlaying, for example, some of your engagement surveys that you might have with employees, and including questions specifically on diversity and inclusion, and understanding from your employee population how they are perceiving the work and the efforts that you're doing, and overlaying that against the data that you might have, whether it is for a particular group or function, and taking those data measures into account is really important. If you have implemented affinity groups and employee resource groups, getting their feedback on various issues. We're not necessarily advocating that it should be a sort of a complaint session. You have to have the proper procedures in place for addressing those, but use the employee resource groups to help you understand where best to focus your efforts and to move forward within your organization. Many employers are engaging in these really tough conversations and having small focus groups or small feedback groups to understand the key areas of where further development is needed. That might help you actually understand differences from one function to the next. So what's going on across the organization may be different than a particular business unit might be facing. We talked about the industry benchmark reports. But, third-party feedback is also very helpful. There's a lot of apps that are out there now, and while it may be sort of annoying to have your name out there in a negative way, take that information and understand it and use it as an organization to build into your overall inclusion and diversity strategy. As I said, this is not a sort of a cookie cutter analysis. There is no one way to do inclusion and diversity. There's frameworks and guideposts that we tend to follow, but organizations are so different, and you do have flexibility to shape the analysis and shape the types of data that you get and use and implement within your organization to not only understand what the data shows you from a picture perspective, but to also understand getting behind it. What's the reason that it's happening at your specific organization, that where you're not seeing a particular group, you're not seeing Black employees at the highest ranks of the organization? What's behind it, and how do you, sort of get underneath it in order to implement the strategic focus and effort on that specific area? With that, I want to read off our CLE code, and that is Seyfarth Shaw 252. Sorry, it's SS as in Seyfarth Shaw. Sorry about that. 2525. I'll read that again. It's SS 2525. And with that, I'll turn it over to Laura, who's going to kick us off with transparency and accountability.
Excellent. And you all should jump in here at any time. We've also been trying to answer questions as we go along. We were getting quite a number of them in, so we apologize if we haven't yet reached your question. But before we end, we'll do a quick read through those, and Annette and Mike and I may just pick a few to answer if we have some time at the end. So we wanted to next talk about some key issues that come up once you have set goals or once you've done the work that Annette and Mike have outlined here. So in the next slide, we'll talk first a little bit about issues related to transparency. So, we've already seen some questions on this. Is it okay for us to share information about goals that we set or benchmarking that we do? This is also something that is not one size fits all, but we are seeing across the board with many of our clients much greater demand at the board level from shareholders, in fact, some activists sometimes, and then also employees around pay and workforce demographics. So we like to consider a number of different very important issues when deciding, whether and how to disclose this type of information. So first, obviously, industry. There are some industries where it is essential that you are disclosing certain information. Essential may be a strong word. It's strongly recommended because most other similar companies within an industry are disclosing the information, and it's expected by certain talent within an industry. It also is important to consider company culture. Do you have a highly transparent culture? We deal with some companies quite often that have a very data-driven, data-centric culture, and we sometimes see just individual employees in the HR department or with access to certain information wanting to just, use the data, around representation themselves. So it's necessary to sort of get out in front of that. Some other cultures don't have that same level of transparency or data-focused culture. There's also obviously, issues around business imperatives. Now we would see, or we see actually quite a bit more decisions being made around business imperatives now that people want to have more transparency when there is this greater demand, and certainly what's happened in the last month or two following the murder of George Floyd, and the way in which there has been a groundswell of reaction to that, along with the many other, tragic incidents of that type that we've seen, not just George Floyd. So you consider all of those various aspects of, and issues, along with others. Obviously, we're just touching on things that are more common for most companies, and deciding, what will you share and then who you will share it with. So some of the issues here that we like to manage to certainly are the impact of the communication on your workforce. And so what are you going to share is key. Sometimes sharing specific goals without the background about how you formulated the goal or what information went into that can feel demoralizing to someone who doesn't understand how you formulated the goal. So, for example, if you have a low percentage goal for increasing, for example, Hispanics in your workforce or Latinx folks within your workforce, you may be doubling or tripling your current representation over a series of years, but that may still look like a very low percentage. So how you talk about numbers and the way in which you communicate it is very, very important. And then obviously who you share it with. So there's a very big difference from publishing company-wide or even publicly on a website various data and goals you have as compared to with your leadership teams, for example, in a confidential meeting. So there's a lot of considerations there. In the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about transparencies in terms of pros and cons. So, being transparent, obviously there are a lot of pros around this. So obviously in the positive relations with your employees, applicants, or other stakeholders, if companies are seen as being transparent and sharing this kind of information, it can go a long way to foster goodwill, with various stakeholders. Obviously, you also have greater control over the message. So you get to control the messaging around your I&D journey. I&D is inclusion and diversity for people who don't use that terminology. And it allows you to essentially frame and shape the story in the way you talk about the work that the company is doing. This also, you can have a positive association by looking proactive. So we've seen a lot of clients be fairly proactive in this way, taking on sometimes the legal risks that we'll talk about in the cons section here in a minute by being transparent. But then in doing so, their level of transparency allows people to then move on from questioning as to why they're not being transparent or not sharing information to more of an action-oriented environment where people want to pitch in and assist as compared to be skeptical and ask questions about the fact that they are not sure the status of the company or, the work that might be done by the company in the I&D area. And then also, like I just touched on, there is a potential to drive action. So the more you share, the more people can get involved. They can raise their hand. They can contribute, throughout the company in your efforts. And there's a little bit more grounding around how or why you might be taking action as a company or pushing certain initiatives or programmatic type strategies. So in the cons section, because of course, we are the employment lawyers, we have to talk about the cons part. So first, making public disclosure obviously highlights your areas of opportunity. And so there could be ways in which your data, doesn't look positive or in certain ways can be read in a negative way. We're using areas of opportunity as language here because we think that really every organization probably has them. But then again, that's something you want to consider in terms of how there could be a negative impact in transparency. Obviously, as Mike and Annette talked about, there isn't a single way to assess inclusion and diversity or assess your representation within a company. By disclosing information, we have seen the effect of lots of questioning and conversation about how the data was, put together, and there being questions about, it being, manipulated, or we don't understand the basis for this, or, where did it come from? It gets a lot to the methodology rather than, your actual efforts or the results that you see. Obviously, there could be additional scrutiny from regulatory agencies or, frankly, plaintiffs. We have seen in some instances this type of information be used later in litigation or otherwise. So you always want to, review the disclosure of any data or any information from that lens to make sure that you have a carefully built framework on the back end to be able to defend, against any later claims. Sometimes there can also be greater demands on data. So if you decide just to disclose sort of high-level aspects of your data or high-level aspects of your goals or the benchmarks, that can sometimes lead to people saying, oh, well, what about my part of the organization, or what about my team? I'm going to go to my manager and ask them, and then there's, trickling up or bubbling up of additional questions and requests about people then being hungry for more data. And then also, downward trends can be highlighted and they have to be explained. So meaning if you don't make progress on your goals or you end up having a downward trend in your data over time, that can obviously be something to worry about and something that you would have to actively manage from a transparency perspective. One other thing we wanted to talk about, which is common, and we get a lot of questions about this when we're having conversations with employers about setting goals or using benchmarks, and we'll go over this in the next slide. So those common issues here are about accountability. And we have 4 different ways in which accountability related to goals and benchmarks come into play and where we do get questions from our clients. One being around leadership accountability. Once we set benchmarks or goals, how do we hold our leaders accountable? The next being manager goals. So if leaders have adopted them, what do we do for the next level manager, your managers of your people around those goals and objectives, and how much do you share with them? Should there be a compensation impact if people do not reach goals or reach the goals associated with certain benchmarks? And then finally, should there be performance measures? So with respect to each of these, we note here that this is, again, a tricky area for some employers where the difference between mandatory quotas or set-asides should be very different from what we're looking at as aspirational goals. So while you do want to hold your leaders and managers accountable, you don't want to do it in a way that makes them behave as if the goals are mandatory, are in fact a quota. Or some type of mandatory set-aside. And what I mean by that is you want to hold people accountable, but you want to hold them accountable to behaviors associated with supporting your diversity and inclusion initiatives, as well as creating a culture of inclusion, as compared to, for example, punishing them or cutting their comp if they do not meet the goals, which again would perhaps drive some managerial behavior more towards operating like they are dealing with mandatory goals or set-asides. So again, we recommend that accountability be measured in terms of driving certain behaviors. How many people have they mentored? Are they creating a sense of inclusion within their teams? Are they driving to create a sense of belonging for everyone? Are they supporting their various team members? Are they engaged with their team? As compared to, did you meet a number or did you not meet a number that we set forth in your goal? In terms of compensation there as well, we would say that you can measure to, you compensate based on behaviors. Again, are they participating with the company's diversity and inclusion programming and initiatives? Are they out interviewing and active in trying to build a pipeline of diverse talent? And, in their performance, are they exhibiting inclusive leadership behaviors? So some of those behaviors and the way in which you incentivize leaders and managers, we may cover in a future episode of our diversity and inclusion programming. So we wanted to thank you for being with us today. If you have follow-up questions, we see that there were many we didn't get to in the program. We'd be delighted to chat with you about those, and we invite you to join us for the next in the series of our diversity and inclusion programming. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We look forward to hearing from you and talking with you about more issues in the series soon.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending.